Presented exclusively by Mother's Polish.
Welcome back to another edition of the Slipstream Podcast. This is your host, Brady, and joining me in the Slipstream tonight for this midweek episode is my boy, Matthew. What's up, buddy?
What's going on?
So for this episode, we're going to continue our little Formula One 101 series and do some rapid-fire Formula One slang to make sure you sound like an expert when you're watching the Singapore Grand Prix this weekend with your buddies. And also, we'll quickly cover the news of the week in Formula One and give you all a quick preview of the Singapore Grand Prix. So for a little bit of Formula One slang, we all sit there and we watch the Formula One broadcasts every week when there's a race. And for many of you, you might be new to Formula One, and sometimes you might want to know what the heck the guys are talking about. And so we figured we'd just run through sort of rapid fire some of the more common themes that you hear during a race weekend, whether it's through practice, qualifying, or during the race. So Matt, to kick us off, let's start with the undercut. What is the undercut?
Yeah, so the undercut is essentially a driver's out on the track and he is struggling to get past a driver, or he's stuck in a DRS train where he can't really make a move to get around a few guys or one guy. And so instead of pitting on kind of the planned schedule, he may go in 1, 2, 3 laps early to quote unquote undercut the driver by getting fresh tires to when he gets out of the pits to be able to run some quick laps. So when the guy that he couldn't pass goes into pit, he's gained up enough time that he passes that guy before he can actually get out of the pit. So he's going for an undercut on the pit cycle, and it should, or hopefully gets him out in front of the guy that he couldn't get actually past on the track, so he uses the pit cycle to actually help him move forward in the race, and then it puts that other driver at a disadvantage because now unless they do another pit cycle, if it's a 2-pit or a 3-pit race, then they could try to get back. But if it's only a 1-pit race, then that guy actually has to pass him on the track at that point because he did the undercut and did it to perfection, hopefully.
Yeah, you see the undercut a lot. I think I'm trying to think the race that was. I don't know if it was Zandvoort or Austria, but the undercut was massive. It was like 4-second difference, and the people who pull the pit trigger quicker gain a little track position. And to your point, they don't actually have to make the move on the track. So the undercut is very important. And sometimes there's an advantage to the overcut. Someone may extend their first stint a little bit longer because their tires may not have as much wear as the other guy who already pit, and may actually gain an advantage through the overcut. So sometimes that is track dependent, but definitely an important part of the overall Formula One strategy.
Yeah, I mean it's a big thing, and you'll hear it every single race. There'll be a race within the race between a few drivers. So any race you watch, in Singapore this week, in Japan, at COTA, at Brazil, you will hear the word undercut at some point in all of these races. And so now you'll know. If you didn't know before, you'll kind of understand what they're talking about. And go on to the next one. What about bottoming in a race car on an F1 track?
Yeah, so not to be confused with something called passive bottom. If you've ever had back surgery, you can relate to what that is. But so bottoming in a Formula One car, quite simply and literally, means when the underside of the car hits the track. So basically when the car bottoms out. It's usually caused by bumps in the track or sudden rise or crest, kind of like Eau Rouge at Spa.
Porpoising.
Yeah, and so you've probably heard a little bit or a lot about this, especially earlier in the season when porpoising was all you would ever hear during a Formula One race. And so porpoising quite literally was the phenomenon of the car continuously bottoming out and repeatedly hitting the ground due to the air effect on the vehicle. So sometimes you'll hear a driver say, the car had good balance, although on my qualifying lap, it was bottoming out and I lost some time. So basically, when your F1 car or any car really hits the track, there's a little bit of friction there, which actually slows the car down. It's one of the main reasons why Mercedes early in the year and they've improved it, but earlier in the year they were really struggling with the porpoising issue, and their car was bottoming out over and over and over, especially on the long straightaways, and was causing them quite a bit of performance. So yeah, that's what bottoming is in Formula One car, and it's not to be confused with anything with the gluteus maximus. So moving on to the next slang is outperforming the car. What does that mean, Matt?
Yeah, outperforming the car is essentially when a driver gets more out of his car than would be expected. Going into each week, F1 teams kind of have a idea of where they're going to end up. You kind of have an idea of the standings going into the season, and then if a guy can get more out of that car than expected, Fernando Alonso is one of those guys that gets a lot out of the car, more than you would expect, more than where you would think an Alpine would place. And if you go back to the beginning of this season, the guy that was outperforming his car more than anybody was Bottas. Now, he struggled after the first 6-7 races, but those first 6-7 races, he was outperforming the car because of how well he was performing and finishing in races compared to what you would expect the Alfa Romeo to finish at. So it's essentially just, is the driver getting more out of his car than you would expect the car to do on an average driver, essentially.
I think a lot of times you'll see that in qualifying too. I think a great example of that is Lando. Lando's incredible in qualifying, gets the most out of that one lap, but then over the course of a race, the McLaren isn't quite up to speed to some of the other, Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes, and maybe even the Alpine this year.
And he may
so he's
be
a good example of that.
Yeah, he may be doing a better job of anybody this year of outperforming his car just as a whole on the season. I mean, if you look where Danny Rick is compared to where he is, if you want to say the car somewhere in the middle of that, I mean, he's well outperforming what the McLaren probably should be doing.
Agreed.
Now, all right, let's move on to the next one. What about back markers? You're getting a lot of the backside of the
Whoever scripted this wants me to talk about bottoming and back markers, I guess. But for back markers, that you could almost call this, or you could assume that this is Latifi's nickname. Only kidding. Sorry, Latifi. I know you're on your way out. But back markers are really those drivers who are at the back of the F1 field. So as you go throughout a Grand Prix, I think, unfortunately, one part of Formula One racing is that there are times or there are tracks where the grid is incredibly spread out. And so, in the American sense, when you watch NASCAR, it's basically lapping those cars, right? So a back marker are those cars that are at the back of the F1 field who are often being lapped. And so what you'll see a lot of times on the broadcast is, someone like Max or Charles or whoever's up front passing back markers, meaning they're lapping the traffic ahead of them. And one of the things that the back markers receive while they're on the track are blue flags. So if you get a blue flag that's waved in front of you on the digital sign, you're supposed to move over and give the leading car kind of an easy path by you. There have been times where I think Seb did it earlier this year, where he ignored the blue flags and ultimately got a penalty because he didn't let the leading car pass in a timely fashion. So, one thing I'm sure Formula One would like to reduce is the number of back markers, but it certainly plays a role. Sometimes if there's a couple of back markers in your way, it might slow down either your charge to the front or keeping the lead that you have, and could close that gap or expand that gap based on what the back markers do. A lot of times you hear the guys on the radio being like, that back marker blocked me and completely ruined my race by getting stuck behind him. And it's not to be confused with a lower back tattoo, Matt.
I don't have one of those, but I may get a Max one at the end of the year.
Prove it.
Yeah. So we can post on the Instagram, the TikTok, all that kind of stuff. But I believe you get 3 blue flags. Like you get essentially the 3. Is it 3 or is it a time? I think where
I thought it was 5.
Maybe it's 5. Where the digital flags. If you go past more than a certain number, 5, then you do get the penalty. Seb got that one in Zandvoort on Lewis Isn't it Zandvoort when they came out right there and Lewis was making a charge to gain more time on Max and Seb held him back for about 5 or 6 seconds? He lost a bunch of time there.
Yeah, that was when it was like Seb came out of the pits and it was almost like he had no idea there was someone near him. And then it was Lewis and Checo who were fighting for position. And he was like, oh, you guys are here? Whoops. So yeah, he got a penalty for that. So for the next F1 slang, tell us a little bit about flat spotting. And I'm not talking about your hair.
Yeah, there. For anybody that does follow us on Instagram, TikTok, see the YouTube videos, my head is as bald as the tires that these F1 drivers go on. So yeah, though I will say, nicely shaped, pretty round. Not many flat
I was going to
spots on
say,
this though.
they're more like softs, mediums, or hards. What you got going on up there?
Oh, it's definitely hard head up here. Yeah. Flat spot essentially happens, and we can kind of do 2 in 1 here. Flat spotting on a tire happens when a driver locks up on the brakes. And locking up essentially means when they hit the brakes and it causes the front tires to stop rotating. And you will notice it pretty easily when somebody's going into a turn and all of a sudden it looks like a bomb of like smoke just went off because it causes such friction between the tire and the track and the brakes that just a huge puff of smoke goes up, and essentially you can almost see this driver skid across the track. And that skidding and that friction and the tire not rotating causes a flat spot, exactly what the word says. It is a flat spot on the tire, which hinders performance, can cause an unsmooth ride, and depending on how bad it is, some guys do actually have to pit because of it, because the tire is essentially useless after that point. So if they do get a flat spot, some can make it through depending on how bad it is, but there are times where you'll see a guy have to make an extra pit or pit early because of his lockup causing that flat spot.
And I think one other time to sort of keep an eye on this, obviously it's important during the race because if you lose performance, then you obviously lose, track position, but it's also during practice. Sometimes a guy will throw on a fresh set of mediums. Like if you think about Monza, where a lot of guys locked up into turn one. And if you flat spot a brand new set of mediums that you're trying to get some information about how your race performance is going to be, you may have just ruined all of that track time. When you're trying to go 15, 20 laps on a set of mediums in practice and you flat spot it in turn one, you've kind of ruined that portion of your practice. So definitely a key thing to look out for.
You lose data, you lose tires. Race obviously more important on the points, but if you do it in a practice or a qualifying, it can really set you back and hurt you on your data throughout the entire weekend. So something I don't know how to do in F1 2022 going up Eau Rouge, 99% chance of me crashing on that because I don't lift and coast. I'm full gunning it the entire time, even on worn tires, wet tires, intermediates. So explain to me what lift and coast is, because I don't even do it myself.
Yeah, I think there's a couple times throughout a race where a driver may need to lift and coast. One of them, you'll see this at Eau Rouge, and you'll see this at I want to say Silverstone, where you're going down. I think it's the hanger straight. You're making that first hairpin right. You kind of do the confidence lift, where you just kind of lightly let off the gas, don't touch the brakes, and you kind of lift and coast through the turns. Another reason why a driver may have to lift and coast during the race is a couple of reasons. Maybe one, the brakes are too hot and you need extra air to go through the brakes to cool them down. Or one thing that's interesting about a Formula One car is that they are fueled for the precise amount of laps that are going to be ran. There really isn't a whole lot of extra fuel on board of a Formula One car. So a lot of times you may hear an engineer come over the radio and tell their driver to lift and coast if it looks like they're burning a little bit too much fuel and they may not make it to the end of the race. So the engineer may tell them to lift and coast, which basically means they lift off the throttle and cruise into the braking zone. So they're not using the brakes and they're not using the throttle, which uses less fuel, although it obviously slows down their pace a little bit. So there could be some other reasons. You'll hear lift and coast throughout a race to save that fuel, or sometimes you'll have a driver to or an engineer tell a driver to stay off the curbs. It's all about the maintenance of the vehicle, whether it's an engine, a brake, or a fuel issue. So that's a little bit about lift and coast, and Matt will work on it in F1 2022 for you.
Hey, one race streak in Belgium that I didn't lose it there. Lost it, still DNF'd, but not going up Rouge.
Trying to remember the guy's name from a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the most DNFs or consecutive DNFs in Formula One history. And he, 71% DNF rate? You might be up there in Formula or F1 2022.
Yeah, I didn't have that DNF rate in 2021. I just hadn't gotten the hang of the new one yet. But I'm 100%, 70% DNF rate at this point.
I'm with you there. I've DNF'd a few more times this year.
Yeah, sometimes not my fault on the back straight of Canada. When somebody crashes in front of me and I can't, we won't name names. It starts with a B and it ends in a Rady. But yeah.
Yeah, that was one where I did the exact opposite of lift and coast and did a little bit of a brake check on Danny Rick. And I think I caused three of us to DNF. So anyways, two more on the F1 slang, and not to be confused with something else, but what does it mean to box, Matt?
Box. It means it is an instruction to pit. Most of the time you'll hear it from the driver's team telling them to come in and pit this lap. Sometimes we even have the driver say that he needs to box. I believe going back to Zandvoort, George said that we should box. He used that term during the safety car to get the softs put on, which moved him back a spot, but eventually still got him the most points out of the Mercedes team. It comes from the German phrase Boxenstopp. That's a terrible German accent, but
it sounded perfect.
Yeah, thank you. It essentially just means to pit, and the radios from team to driver are public, so other teams can hear this. So they try to be coy about things. They don't want to say too many things over the public part of the airways that everybody can hear. So sometimes you will see, and Ferrari's done it a few times, well, they'll call in a decoy box. I'm not sure like if the inflection is different or whatever, but they'll say box, and then they don't go into the pits to try to throw a team off to maybe make Red Bull, if Max is in front or Sergio's in front of one of the Ferraris, to see if it'll force them to go in because they think Ferrari is going into box. So
I think you just made up a new F1 slang with decoy box. That might be a new one we have to add to the list.
Well, they this is what they pay me to do. So,
but yeah, I know that you brought it up, but there's been a couple times this year where Ferraris messed that up. Either they told their driver to box and the driver stayed out, or vice versa, like in Monaco when Charles was already in the pits and they told him to stay out. So they've had their few moments this year, as we've talked about many times. Never gets old.
Yelling at signs to box in the middle of like him going back and forth with Sergio for like 4 turns, and he's like basically telling them to shut up. So, so last one on the agenda for this F1 101 episode. Oversteer and understeer. What does that mean to a driver in F1?
Yeah, so this is a good one. And if you ever do tune in on Wednesday nights when we do our Slipstream podcast league race on Twitch in F1 2022, you hear our buddy Austin, who is sort of a master at car setups, talk about, my car's feeling a little understeery or oversteery. And quite frankly, every time he says that, I'm like, I have no idea what my car's doing, to be honest, or at least I have no idea how to fix it. So I kind of go in a little bit of blind, mess things around, and make it feel good so that makes my car feel like it can make all the corners. But essentially, oversteer and understeer is really during cornering. Oversteering is when the rear wheels of a car lose its grip, causing the back end to step out. You could almost call this like fishtailing if you're on like a wet road, right? Understeer, on the other hand, is when the front wheels lose grip, which sees the car travel at a shallower angle than the one the driver is asking for when steering the wheel. So you hear that a lot, especially during probably practice when the guys are trying to dial in their setup for the race and for qualifying. you'll hear them say, I have no grip, or I'm getting a lot of understeer in turn 6, or a lot of oversteer in turn 6. And so they do a lot of things, whether it's wing angles, ride height, etc., to make sure that their car is set up the way that they want it to perform at any given track. So definitely something you hear often on your Formula One track. Not something you really ever experience behind the wheel of your own personal vehicle, at least on purpose, but definitely an important part of Formula One. Yeah, that was our F1 101 slang, our Formula One slang. We hope that now we've helped you better understand some of the more common features and themes throughout a Formula One race weekend, especially when listening to the broadcast. And wherever you watch the Singapore Grand Prix this weekend with some new friends of yours that may be into Formula One, you'll sound like an expert. So to wrap up this episode, we'll just highlight a couple of the news items that have happened in the world of Formula One over the last couple of days. So first, I believe it happened today, is that Alfa Romeo confirmed Zhou Guanyu for the 2023 season. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
I'm happy for him. Getting another chance. He had that awful wreck earlier in the year, scary wreck. He has seemed to be frisky when he doesn't DNF or have some issue that causes him to essentially be at the back of the pack from a car standpoint. Alfa Romeo, I believe, has the most DNFs of any team this season. Most of it actually being due to the car and not the driver. And he's been frisky. He's been pretty good when those issues haven't happened. So I'd like to see what he can do if Alfa Romeo can get those reliability issues fixed, and what could he do with a full season, kind of with a better, more reliable car underneath him. I mean, it's his rookie year, poor quality of vehicle. You can't really judge him fully off of just this season, so it'd be nice to see what we can get out of him next year if Romeo can get a better product on the track.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes sense for Alfa Romeo. I know that, in the announcement, Joe talked about how he felt sort of the immense pressure of being the first ever Chinese Formula One driver. But to his credit, I believe he scored points in his first race of his F1 career, which is pretty exciting. But yeah, I mean, I know Alfa Romeo started off at least looking like they were going to be high performers this year, maybe outperform their car, like we talked about, or outperform expectations this season. I know Bottas was off to a great start earlier this year, and then all of a sudden they just can't finish a race. It seems like, not really to driver error or crash. Of course, Joe had that one crazy crash in Silverstone. Yeah, lots of DNFs for Alfa Romeo. So I'm happy for him. I think he deserves year 2 in that seat. So good for Zhou Guanyu. We look forward to good things next year. Another bit of news for 2023 is the FIA, I believe today, also confirmed that there will be 6 sprint races for 2023. So I know the calendar came out last week, and now they've confirmed 6 tracks. I believe those tracks are Bahrain, Imola, Canada, Austria, the Netherlands, and Brazil. So yeah, pumped about that. I have a couple quick thoughts. I think I definitely like the way a sprint weekend flows in terms of just the excitement. It sort of makes practice more interesting. You get right into qualifying on Friday instead of Saturday, and then you have, that mini sprint race to look forward to on Saturday. My only sort of thought about sprint races in general is I don't know if there's enough risk taking in the sprint race, because the reality is, while there are points available during a sprint race, no one's gonna. I mean, you saw last year where I think Max crashed or Lewis crashed during a sprint race, and it ruins the main race for, at least for them. So I just hope, while I'm excited that there's 6 sprint races next year, I hope that they continue to incentivize them to actually race, and to not just be more of like a procession where the top 5 don't really take any risks, because they don't want to hurt their chances on Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a cool thing. I think 6 is a good number. I don't think that'll be what, 6, 12, 18, almost 25% of the races, just a little bit more. I don't think you really should have more than that, from like the points you've stated. As fans, it gives almost like an extra race to us, right? It almost gives 29 races instead of 23. But you also don't want 6 boring Saturdays where you're just sitting there watching guys do laps and you may have a couple of guys overtakes. It'll be interesting to see through these. I guess it was 3 this year, 6 next year. Was it 2 the year before? So we'll have 11 total. Be interesting to see how many overtakes there are in these sprint races versus an actual real race. So is what you're saying from a data standpoint um, actually happening? I mean, that's the point of the sprint race, is to be able to gain ground or not to lose it if you're up near the top. And if that's not happening, if guys aren't making moves, then qualifying just seems to be a better option. You get points, sure. Maybe there's a money incentive. That might be pretty cool. If you wherever you finish or whatnot, eventually down the path. But uh, good for the sport, as our buddy Cole Trickle says. Missing him tonight, so I like it. I like where it's heading. Let's just see if it benefits in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is I do appreciate Formula One and FIA being willing to sort of experiment with the overall flow of the weekend. I'm still a firm believer that I think they should award small points, but points for qualifying. I think you can make the argument that qualifying is the most important part of the weekend, and there are absolutely no points awarded. So I don't know. I could see a bonus point in the future, and maybe they used to do this in the past, going to the pole sitter, or maybe 3 points for first, 2 for second, 3 for third, something like that. So that's one thing I'd like to see them do. But I am appreciative that they're willing to make some tweaks and give us some more exciting racing throughout the weekend. So last bit of news, quick news. I know this will make our boy Cole sad a little bit, but the FIA has officially rejected the super license for Colton Herta. So he's going to have to look for another path to gain those points needed to be eligible for a Formula One seat.
Yeah, that's a bummer, especially from an American, obviously American-based podcast. Bummer for us. We haven't had an American race in F1 since Scott Speed in 2006-7, I think was the last time. So we're at 15 years of no American driver. Herta would have been the next one. So the only one really left potentially for next year would be Logan Sargent. He's been kind of rumored in this Latifi seat. So there still is a possibility for an American driver. It will be interesting to see what Herta. It seems like AlphaTauri was really pushing for him and trying to get him this seat. And now if they go and fill it with somebody with a multi-year contract, is he out of F1 for next year and the next year, or is somebody else interested in him? Is he losing multiple years because of this rejection?
Yeah, and I know we touched on this in our last episode, but the one thing I'll give Colton credit for is he didn't want to be an exception. So he's willing to do the right thing or whatever is needed to become eligible to hopefully have that seat. And I know Zach Brown, who runs McLaren Racing, came out and said while they'd love to have an American in the sport, he doesn't think an American driver is dependent on the success of Formula One in the United States. So yeah, I agree with that. I don't know if we need one, but obviously, here in America, we'd love to have one and give us another person or group to cheer for. So unfortunate to him, but still sounds like he has an opportunity in the.
And I believe he's 8 points short. So if he's I would assume is staying in IndyCar, or if he moves into the Formula 2 or Formula 3, you get more points in Indy than you do Formula 3. So if he stays in Indy or goes to Formula 2, as long as he, I believe, finishes higher, 7th or higher in the championships in Formula 2 or 5th or higher in the IndyCar series, he'll get those 8 points. So if he does that in this upcoming season in one of those leagues, then he would be eligible after the 2023 season to join F1 for anybody.
Yeah, so that's good. It sounds like he still has a path, but unfortunately, it won't be in 2023. So we'll look to silly season next year to see if he's able to make it. So to wrap up this episode, we'll just do a quick preview of the Singapore Grand Prix. I know, Matt, you're probably like me, excited that the guys are going to be back on the track this week. I still think it's crazy how they travel all over the world to perform Formula One races in basically every continent, or almost every continent. I think South Africa is rumored to be coming next year, and Antarctica, I guess, will never happen. But still, these guys travel the world to put on Formula One races. So the guys return to the track beginning on Friday, which is Max Verstappen's birthday, to the Singapore Grand Prix, where they haven't raced since 2019. So basically, I don't know if you saw the video floating around on social media, but some people took a video of pit lane, and it as if it had not been touched since 2019. It still had the driver name cards for Seb at Ferrari. Kimi Räikkönen hadn't retired. It was kind of like they raced there, then COVID happened, and it just time stood still. So excited to get back to Singapore. We're going to race it tomorrow night on Twitch, or we were going to do it tomorrow night on Twitch, but our next league race, because it's been a while since we've raced it. It's been a while since Formula One raced it. It's been a while since we've raced it. One cool thing that I think about is that it's a night race. So it's not actually at like 2 a.m. where we are, Matt. It's going to be at sort of the normal time. They're racing more on like European time, and it's going to be at night. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm pumped. It's a very tight track. It is a very fun track. Night races are always a blast. It looks so good on TV, the night races.
It does.
So just the view of it and like kind of the art of racing will be on display in Singapore. Fun fact for Singapore. So in the last 9 races, I believe, in Singapore, 2011 to 2019, 8 of those have been won by your favorite driver, Sebastian Vettel, or Lewis Hamilton. The only one that was not won was won by Nico Rosberg the year that I believe he won the championship. So 8 out of the 9 of the last races in Singapore have been won by the 2 old guys on the track. So I would assume we get some new blood this weekend. But
one thing that might give this old guard a chance. Now, maybe Mercedes has a chance at Singapore just in general, but and you never know. Obviously, this can change between now when we're recording this and when they actually get to the track this weekend. But there is rain in the forecast, so we haven't had a rain race in quite some time. So maybe we're finally. I know Belgium, there was forecast for rain. I think Zandvoort forecast for rain, and it never happened. They ended up being pretty dry weekends. So we'll see if that actually happens and the rain sticks for Singapore this weekend. But it always spices things up, especially in qualifying. And we saw last year when George finished P2 in qualifying for Spa and got his first podium, even though it was a shortened race. So you never know what can happen in the wet weather.
Those first few turns at Singapore in wet weather could be dicey at best with 20 cars on the track. So I'd love to see a full-on rain night race in Singapore. That'd be I think you'd get a lot of entertainment out of that if that happened.
Yeah, I think to your point, the first couple turns would be incredible, especially with a jumbled up grid. I'm going to go ahead and put the over under at like half a lap for a safety car if it is wet, and maybe there'll be 3 or 4 or 5 safety car. Hopefully not, but you never know. I think wet weather always spices things up like that a little bit. So we'll see if that sticks. They're going to do 61 laps over a 5.063 kilometer Marina Bay street circuit this weekend. So I'm looking forward to it. I know McLaren's going to run a special livery this weekend, so I'm excited to see that, especially under the lights. Excited to have the guys back on the track. This feels like the second summer break or fall break that we've had in a while. We were spoiled with 3 race weekends in a row, but it's been too long. I'm ready to see some racing.
Yeah, me too. And another thing for the 2 older guys on the track. One, since it hasn't been raced, some of these young guys haven't had the experience there. And 2, if you kind of look back over the last couple of years, these more difficult tracks that are more dependent on how good the driver is versus the car, these older guys tend to perform well, especially Seb. Seb does perform well. He performs well in Monaco.
Baku.
They kind of fit him a little bit just because of his knowledge and his experience. So if you got some F1 fantasy on Grid Rivals going this weekend, If you got an open contract, maybe throw Seb in there for a one race contract this weekend. He may surprise you. He may get you a little over what his salary is for you.
Yeah, I think I've avoided Seb for those that follow the podcast for obvious reasons. He's a little bit washed, but yeah, I agree. I think he tends to have the success, at least later in his career, the last couple of years on these street circuits. So perhaps he'll give us one more magical moment before he rides off into the sunset. But yeah, so that's it for our midweek episode. Wanted to come to you guys with a little bit of our F1 101 and educate you guys on some Formula One slang so that you're well prepared for the Singapore Grand Prix this weekend. So, Matt, don't get carried away, bottoming out too much over the next few days before the race this weekend. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back with you all to recap the Singapore Grand Prix later this weekend. Peace.
Peace out.